social integration, social security, and national solidarity, Honorable Ashok Osmo. Junior Minister of Social Integration, Social Security, and National Solidarity, Honorable Valayan Paraben. Senior Chief Executive, Ministry of Social Integration, Social Security, and National Solidarity, Ms. Madhav. Permanent Secretary of the Social Integration Division, Mrs. Oladip Okoroni. Permanent Secretary of Social Security and National Solidarity Division, Mrs. Bahadou. Chairman of the Board, National Empowerment Foundation, Mr. Otesh Rambel. Acting Director of Statistics, Mr. Aryan Naik. Officer in charge of National Empowerment Foundation, Mrs. Krishna Gregor. Secretary General, National Social Inclusion Foundation, Mr. Saudagar. Distinguished representatives of Statistics Mauritius, our esteemed partners, experts from Oxford University, Mr. Derek Appel and Dr. Frank Goldberg, representatives of non-governmental organizations and civil society organizations, representatives of ministries and LEF, board members of NEF, members of the press, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. It is indeed a pleasure for me to welcome you all to this important consultation session on the proposed National Multidimensional Poverty Index. You will recall that in October 2025, during the National Symposium held in the context of the International Day for the Eradication of Poverty, one of the commitments emerging from our deliberations were the development of an MPI for Mauritius. Statistics Mauritius also made a presentation on the proposed framework, noting that the index was still under development. Today's consultation marks a significant milestone in that journey. We are gathering here to take stock of the progress made thus far, more importantly to engage in a constructive dialogue to further refine and strengthen the proposed national NPI. This session is designed as a participatory platform to incorporate your insights and practical experience into the framework of the index before its finalization. Allow me to briefly outline the program for today's session. We shall begin with a keynote address by the Honorable Minister, who will set the tone for our deliberations. This will be followed by a presentation from Statistics Mauritius and from our distinguished experts, Mr. Derek Appel and Dr. Frank Goldberg, who will share technical insights drawing from global experiences in MPI design and implementation. Following these presentations, we shall move into an interactive dialogue session, which I will facilitate. During the segment, I warmly invite you to contribute through questions, clarifications, suggestions, reflections based on field experience, and any constructive appreciation that may further enrich the process. Finally, the session will conclude with a closing remark by the Honorable Junior Minister, after which we shall proceed for lunch. With this, I now have the pleasure to invite the Honorable Minister of Social Integration, Social Security and National Solidarity for his keynote address.
Bonjour, to my camarades. Good morning to our international guests. And c'est la deuxième fois que nous faisons dans ça contexte-là. Il est assez paradoxal et assez aussi painful pour nous discuter la pauvreté dans le monde quand il y a un agrandissement de l'opulence. Il encore plus paradoxal et inefficace pour réaliser que même dans nos pays, nous avons un agrandissement de la richesse, de l'opulence, et de l'autre côté, il y a encore pauvreté. Et Quand nous regardons les derniers chiffres qui sont publiés dans le journal dans les dernières 3 semaines, ils confirment sa tendance au super profit qui peut générer dans nos pays, mais en même temps, il y a pauvreté. Il y a une pensée qui dit comme ça, il y a une lame invisible, pour qu'il y a un ripple down effect, que la richesse qui produit dans une société automatiquement descend à tout le monde et tout le citoyen. Malheureusement, il n'est pas comme ça. Et pendant des années, il y a un courant de pensée, surtout socialiste, qui pensait qu'il visait une corrective measures, une mesure pour qui il y a social transfers à les citoyens, mais surtout à les plus pauvres et plus démunis de la société. Le pays Lincoln est un pays qui a un plus grand social transfers dans le monde. Et dernier rapport, nous comptons suscite ça de statistiques Mauritius qui vont vous dire que fait un très très bon travail. Il dit comme ça que si nous battons les government transfers et les free health services, education, public transport, pauvreté équivaut à 36,4% de la population. Ça veut dire que 500 du monde qui nous est là, 36,4 pauvres au lieu le chiffre qui tourne autour de 8%, 7,3, 8% actuellement. Mais malgré ce transfert-là, qui déroulait dans la société, il y a toujours la pauvreté. C'est pour ça qu'il y a en 2006, le gouvernement d'alors devise un mécanisme, Social Integration and Empowerment Act, qui fonde la NEF et fonde le Social Register pour qu'il capte les gens qui ont plus bas d'échelle et dirige l'aide sociale, l'aide d'État envers ça là. Mais depuis 2006 jusqu'à là, la fondation, les bases dans lesquelles ce système-là fonctionnait, pas changé d'une façon fondamentale. Et c'est justement l'objectif aujourd'hui, c'est pour fondamentalement changer un certain nombre de choses dans l'approche vers la pauvreté. Et c'est clair, aujourd'hui, d'après le système qui nous est là, d'après la misère qui nous est là, nous considérons un adulte pauvre si il gagne autour, vous avez un chiffre exact, autour de 3508 par mois. Okay? C'est le système actuel. Nous considérons une famille qui a 2 adultes avec des enfants pauvres si ils gagnent moins que 14 560 choses. Là, nous considérons les pauvres. C'est ça le système actuel qui nous est là. Et toute politique basée sur la pauvreté, basée sur le social register, est basée sur là. Il repose sur là. Et mon mesure dire qu'il nous fait travail actuellement, plusieurs réunions, nous joignent assez souvent, toutes les semaines, nous joignent une filière qui est là, bon filière, nous joignent toutes les semaines, nous travaillons pour vous. Et nous pouvons réfléchir sur la possibilité pour hausser ça, threshold là, pour les tourner autour de 10 000, mais qui presque ce que World Bank a décidé comment seuil de la pauvreté. Le travail, naturellement, un changement pareil pour que ça gagne la autorité gouvernementale, la autorité finance, pour qu'il nous hausse sa threshold là. Et le système actuel il y a un major defect. Si nous guettons le rapport pauvreté statistique qui est publié par le Bureau statistique en cours, vous trouvez que dans Maurice, basé sur la mesure que le Bureau statistique prend compte, il y a à peu près 101 000 du monde qui supposés comme dans la pauvreté. Or, le système actuel qui nous a, nous capture seulement 31 000, autour de 31 000 du monde. Ça veut dire, nous avons une statistique qui dit à nous, nous avons à peu près 101 du monde qui est dans la pauvreté, mais le système d'État et institutionnel actuel capte seulement autour de 31 000 du monde. Ça veut dire, il y a un major defect dans le système actuel. Et c'est là que un nouveau mécanisme nécessaire pour nous adresser sa major defect. Et c'est là que le multidimensional, multipurpose, multidimensional poverty index, ok, vient en jeu. Et nous avons une très très bonne discussion l'année dernière, en octobre. Et aujourd'hui, c'est une continuation de sa discussion et qu'une phase importante dans sa discussion-là. Et une chose intéressante dans ça, et Multidimensional Poverty Index, c'est le fait qu'il prend en considération non seulement dimension monétaire de l'analyse de la pauvreté, mais d'y introduire une dimension très très importante pour déterminer qui s'en a qui pauvre, qui pas pauvre, l'idée de ce qu'il appelle la déprivation. Ça veut dire, est-ce qu'il gagne un dimoun peut gagner, un dimoun qui donne famille, peut gagner un certain nombre de besoins, un certain nombre de needs, un certain nombre de droits. Et ça concept-là, moi qui suis socialiste, il rejoint beaucoup mon philosophie socialiste. C'est-à-dire, nous guettons l'être humain, comment ben dimoun qui a un besoin social, ben dimoun qui a un basic needs qui la société vise à satisfaire. Et nous pas que domaine monétaire, nous guetter s'il y a assez d'éducation, nous guetter si il y a suffisamment protection avec un logement, nous guetter par exemple s'il y a une disabilité, si vous avez une disabilité dans la famille, ainsi de suite. Ben là, vous pouvez expliquer ça en détail de ça index là, qui mène une considération qui prend l'urbaine déprivation. Et pourquoi ça c'est un concept très très important qui MPI pour introduire. Et une fois que le bureau statistique et Central Statistical Office a adopté sa index là, là, il pouvait être un instrument, un outil qui peut utiliser par la NEF, par le ministère de l'intégration sociale, pour devise une policy qui peut mieux adapter envers les gens qui pauvres, mais aussi qui peut utiliser comme outil ou élaboration d'une politique par l'État lui-même. C'est-à-dire non seulement pour ce ministère-là, pour la lutte contre la pauvreté, mais aussi pour utiliser de manière direct resources code business basé sur cet index-là. Alors donc, nous discutons une chose importante et nous discutons un changement fondamental qui peut amener dans le système, dans la lutte contre la pauvreté, dans l'outil dans la lutte contre la pauvreté, qui fait reste en place depuis 2006. Et c'est ça changement-là qui nous compte amener, qui nous compte discuter aujourd'hui. Après tout, tu veux nous changement, non? Merci.
Thank you, Honorable Minister, for your insights on poverty threshold and on strategy. We will now proceed for the presentation by statistic process. Let me introduce you the team. First, the Mrs. Rambo, statisticians and senior statisticians, who is leading the index. Mr. Derek Appel, from Oxford University, Oxford Poverty and Human Development Initiative, and Dr. Vollmer from the Oxford University researcher, Oxford Poverty and Human Development Initiative. Big round of applause. Thank you. Please proceed for your presentation.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for the introduction, MC. My name is Derek Michel. Met some of you. Pleasure to meet some of you for the first time. My presentation is going to be an introduction, which I think many people have had before, on a new methodology for measuring poverty by non-monetary means. And I stress methodology because it's only a framework. Oxford University provided a framework for measuring multidimensional poverty, but each country defines what poverty means in their context. So it has, I would say, three advantages. I'll mention the fact that in the past I've already mentioned. It gives agency to each country, each context, to define what poverty means to them. Two, it is relevant, conceptually relevant, to the experience of people living in poverty. If you speak with people who are experiencing poverty themselves, they will describe their conditions, not only in terms of lack of money or income, but in other non-money factors. So multidimensional poverty completes the picture of poverty. And thirdly, it has policy relevant outputs. So it tells you who is poor. Not only that, how poor are they, and which factors are driving that poverty. So through that sense, policymakers know where to intervene, but also how to intervene and how much to intervene. So I'll start. So why do we need multidimensional poverty? As I said, poor people define their conditions not only as lack of money or income, but also lack of other non-money factors that are important for their livelihood. Now, if you look at the data that is collected by public statistical offices such as Statistics Mauritius, a lot of those factors that poor people deem as important for their lives are already collected in the surveys and censuses that exist. So we have an opportunity to use that data to calculate multidimensional poverty. And these results, although complementary with what has already been collected in terms of income and monetary poverty, are slightly different. In other words, they capture sometimes the same people, but other times different people who are experiencing a different kind of poverty than lack of income or money. And of course, policymakers recognize this fact, and around the world, a lot of policymakers are pushing and calling for a more complete measure of poverty. And this is in line with countries' commitments under the Sustainable Development Goals to eradicate poverty, all its forms, income and other forms. Of course, when we're talking about poverty, who better to describe what poverty is than the people who are actually experiencing living it on a daily basis? So these are some outcomes that came from a survey conducted by the World Bank around the world in 1999-2000 that sought to amplify the voices of people living in poverty. So these are some of the ways in which they describe their conditions. In Ecuador, for example, someone described their experience of poverty as a lack of focus on the future, they can only focus on the present. In the Philippines, they describe their conditions as lack of food. In Bangladesh, someone described their condition as lack of respect, in other words, they have to wait. In Nigeria, youth described their conditions as lack of education. And in Brazil, a woman who was interviewed described her condition as exposure to violence. So all of these, as you can see, have some relation to income, but in other cases, they are solving them requires tools and instruments that don't often sit within the control of the Ministry of Finance. They go for other social programs and policies. So, in a nutshell, the multidimensional poverty index is a methodology that basically shows the breadth of poverty, in other words, the number of dimensions or challenges or deprivations that the poor people face. It shows the depth, in other words, how poor are they in those dimensions, and the composition, in what ways are they poor, what factors are driving that poverty. So it can be disaggregated by dimension, in other words, to show which dimensions are contributing. It can also be disaggregated by population group. For instance, we're using the census in this case, and the census allows you to disaggregate up to the lowest administrative level with high statistical reliability. It also allows you to disaggregate by vulnerable groups, by age group. Namely, I think this room that is here today, one of the important types of feedback will ask you is what vulnerable groups are relevant to produce results, and the Statistics Mauritius team that is here is going to put those inputs on board and produce them in a paper report. I'll skip over this, I think it's a bit technical. I'll go straight to the steps that are involved in producing a multidimensional poverty index. So the first step, as I said, each country defines what poverty means, the dimensions of poverty in their context. Okay? That could be in the form of health, it could be in the form of education or living standards, or employment in the case of Mauritius. After the dimensions have been defined, within those dimensions, indicators that capture that capture deprivation within those dimensions are selected. Okay? That could be under health, it could be nutrition, it could be access to health, it could be access to health insurance, and education, it could be school attendance, it could be school attainment, it could be access to certain scholastic materials. Each country defines what is important, and that is based on the aspirations and the priorities of the country. So within those indicators, thresholds are chosen. In other words, thresholds for which an individual should have achieved in order for them to be assessed as deprived within those indicators. Once those thresholds are defined and a household is assessed, we count those indicators and weight them. So that count or score for each household is then assessed against the poverty cutoff, which is nationally defined, and anyone satisfying the threshold for poverty is deemed as multidimensionally poor. So in a nutshell, that's how it works. There are different kinds of multidimensional poverty indices around the world. There is a global MPI. So by global, there are about 100 countries that have standardized definitions of poverty around the world and this is published by the UN Human Development Unit each year. Now, Mauritius is not among these countries because some of the definitions of poverty refer to an acute form of poverty, which is no longer present to a large extent in Mauritius, and so some of that data is not collected in Mauritius. There's also regional MPIs, such as in the region there is East African Community, a group of 6 countries that have come together and harmonized definitions of poverty, and I think it has been published once or twice. And at the moment, there's also discussions within the SADC community, of which Mauritius is a member, to produce harmonized measure of poverty. So global and national and regional MPIs are comparable across countries because they have standardized definitions. And then we have national MPIs, which are going to be presented here today. So these are tailored to the national priorities and contexts, and they're not necessarily they're not comparable across countries. I mean, they're used for national policy making and national tracking of progress. While the first two are used to compare across countries. So currently, there are about 45 countries around the world that have published their national definitions of poverty, including six in SADC. We have Angola, Botswana, Malawi, Mozambique, Namibia, and Seychelles. And hopefully, after this exercise, it will lead to a publication of Mauritius. Mauritius will be among these that will publish their national API. So I said from the beginning that this process is inclusive. We've collected a lot of stakeholder input. I think this is the second this kind of symposium. And Chandra from Statistics Mauritius is going to give an overview of the process of compiling and developing the national NPI for Mauritius.
Good morning, everyone. So my name is Chandrani from Statistics Mauritius. So I will present to you the national MPI. So direct talk about the different types of MPI. We have the global MPI and the national MPI. So we need first of all to understand what's the difference. For the global MPI, which means you have a standard list of dimensions and is standard. You cannot change the indicator, you cannot change the indicator. Every country has to work on it, has to measure as per the defined framework. Both and the global MPR is meant for assessing acute poverty, acute deprivation, and we call the extreme poverty. So it is comparable across countries. But for the national NPR, the word itself says national, which means relevant to our country context, our country specific, what matters most for us. Okay? So it is designed based on national priorities, through focus group discussions. So in last year, I don't know whether you remember, during the symposium, we had the phase one, stakeholder engagement, where I presented to you the list of dimensions, housing, education, we had health, so there were so many dimensions. And the first stakeholder engagement, the aim was to gather your views on the dimensions. So based on what we gathered, so for last year, we didn't have only the stakeholders from symposium. We didn't meet only the NGOs working on the poverty side, but we met also the line ministries, the key ministries, and also the parliamentarians. So based on what we gathered, we constructed the national MPI. So to construct the MPI, we need that part of framework. And this is a skeleton how to assess poverty. And here when we are talking about MPI, that is a multi-dimensional poverty. So it can be health, education, any dimensions, but we are not including income. It is a non-monetary dimension. Okay? And then we have, first of all, once we have identified the framework, Secondly, we need to identify the data. The data where we are going to assess that this household is deprived. Once we get our list of dimensions indicators, we have to identify the data. Let's say I want to construct an MPI for this room. Okay, for today we are going to construct an MPI for NEF. Okay. So here I am going first of all to have your views, how to construct the framework. Once I have already identified the framework, now I am going to collect information for every person in this room. So I need to have data for all people in this room. So similarly, as we do our household surveys, we have our census, we gather information, where we gather information, household characteristics, education characteristics, employment characteristics. So here we need to agree on the data source. And the very important key element is we can use only one data source, a single data source. So let's say I have two rooms, okay, or two dogs. We have this person in this dog, and then the other one dog two. So I cannot to construct an NPI for this room. I cannot gather information from people outside this room, at least from another dog. So I need to focus on one single data set. Okay. So slowly you will understand why I'm talking about, and it is very important. So for the phase one, we had a wish list, a very long list of dimensions and indicators. People talk about the housing, employment, health, security. Food security as an important dimension. So we had a very long list. And then in terms of indicators as well, overcrowding to assess NCDs, because there are so many diabetes people in Mauritius. We have the NCD risk factors and teenage pregnancy. So we had a long list of dimensions and indicators. So now we have to identify, once we have these dimensions and indicators, we have to identify what is the relevant data that I can use to assess people on all these dimensions and all the indicators. So we are using the housing population census. The housing population census, which is conducted every 10 years. But we have the full coverage of Mauritius. That is all people accounted and households. We have detailed information on their at geographical level, detailed information on housing, education, employment, disability. So we have the detailed information. Okay. So the dimension identified that we can gather information from the data set is education, housing, health, employment, and living standards. So we have 5 dimensions. So this national MPI is being produced based on the assessment of the households based on the 5 dimensions, all the 5 dimensions. So this is the structure. the national MPI, let's say the national MPI for one household, and I'm going to assess that household based on the 5 dimensions: employment, education, okay? And then within each dimension, I have a set of indicators. So in terms of education, how am I going to assess that households being deprived or not? Based on, let's say we talk about the educational attainment. If the household have a person not attain to any certain level of education, is being deprived. A household with disability, let's say for example, if the household has a member being disabled, so it's deprived. But when we are talking on multi-dimensionally poor, is not we are talking about one dimension. It's not about one indicator. It's about the 5 dimensions. It's about the 15 indicators. So this framework is very important. We are not looking at who being deprived of one indicator. It's based on the 5 dimensions and the 15 indicators. So let's go by dimensions. We take the first dimension, employment. So for employment, we have 3 indicators. 3 indicators, the first one being youth in need. Youth in need means youth not working, not in education, and not in training. Youth in need. And then you have unemployed, that is a member not working, vulnerable employment, as defined by the ILO, all our indicators of aligned with international practices. So vulnerable employment means somebody working as on account worker and or contributing family worker. So here again, the deprived, the multidimensional pool is not measuring deprivation in one indicator, multiple indicators. So when I'm going to assess somebody, I'm going to see the deprivation in terms of youth in need, secondly the second indicator, the third indicator, and then 2 other dimensions. Okay. So this is the first dimension. And then we have standard of living with 4 indicators. First of all is solid waste, that is a household being deprived if garbage disposal is not regularly collected. Second one is pipe water. Pipe water, it's not only pipe water, but pipe water inside housing unit. I know that most of you will say, okay, we have in Mauritius cities 99.5%. So what's the deprivation there? So here we can see the threshold is higher. Household being deprived if there is no pipe water inside the housing unit. And then we have sanitation, that is without flush toilet and is shared with other households. And the fourth one, access to internet. The households being deprived if there is no access to internet. Okay. So later we will come to discussion what you use. So let me read all the indicators here. And the health dimensions. But the health dimensions is female underage marriage. And then second indicator, members suffering from any kind of disability. That is having a lot of difficulty and cannot do at all. So why we focus on female underage marriage? Why? It's here because we are focusing to the health aspect. But it's very often, this is pointing out to teenage pregnancy. There was, we had the policymakers and then the parliamentarians, even at the symposium, we talk a lot about teenage single mothers, teenage pregnancy. So given that we don't have the data, we don't capture data on live birth at this census, so what we got is female underage. And here we are focusing on the health aspect, and we know that according to WHO estimates, these adolescents are very prone to maternal death, maternal health risk. So this is an indicator. And then we have education. Education, we have two indicators. First of one is educational attainment at least a school certificate. Second one being attainment up to primary level, having at least a CPE or, as we say, PESA. The housing dimensions, we have four indicators. The first one is a household is deprived if the dwelling is not fully concrete. Also, we have overcrowding, that is a household with more than 2 people per room on average is deprived. If you know about the UN Habitat, there is a we have the PSUP programs on slums. So one international criteria of overcrowding is to have 3 or more people. If there is 3 or more people in a room, then it is called overcrowding. So here we have the threshold of more than 2. In terms of tenure, if the household is renting, so it is deprived, and flood risk, that is, if a household, the dwelling has ever been flooded or is located to a river, canal, so this household is being deprived. Here we have we took into consideration the climatic factor. So again, I repeat, for the national MPI, we have these dimensions and indicators, and are mostly based on their views. So before the end of this session, we would like to have your views after again, because now we are going to present the preliminary results based on the census data and based on this preliminary national MPI. Do you, Frank?
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm not going to stand over there, so. Yes, thank you very much. What we're going to do now is present some early results. It's also a little bit of showcase of what the MPI will offer once we come to the final product, so to say. So, the first intuitive question, you've heard now, we're going to look at 15 indicators. The first intuitive question, obviously, is, okay, what is the percentage of the population deprived in sanitation, deprived in education, deprived in employment? This is what we're providing in the first kind of key indicator, or key output, which is what we call the uncensored headcount ratio. So the percentage of the population deprived in each indicator. For example, in this graph, we see that the highest percentage of population deprived in each indicator is in education. 42% in the PSAC and 31.8% in the S. So education, we see is quite a bit of an issue. Another example with 21.7% is the vulnerable employment. So many, 21% work on their own account or with family. Yeah, we have access to internet with 20.5%. We have other indicators that are rather low. Yeah, concrete housing materials, for example, is only 2%. So many houses are actually well built. We see other low indicators, for example, on solid waste disposal of 1%. So garbage disposal is quite regulated. So it gives you, in a way, a good understanding of where the deprivations are and who's deprived in each one of them. The second intuitive question is, you have 15 indicators. You're deprived maybe in vulnerable work. You're deprived in sanitation. But when did you actually cross a line where you say, those are so many deprivations that you are multidimensionally poor? And this is what we said, the so-called poverty cutoff. The poverty cutoff is really the critical mass that you reach as a household in terms of deprivations, that you then say you're poor. And that can range between one indicator, 1% so to say, to 15 indicators, or 100%. The lower that is, the higher the percentage of poverty, obviously. So if we would say you're deprived in one indicator only, 80% of the population of Mauritius will be multidimensionally poor. Going up to say 50% of the indicators, more than 7, then you barely catch anybody. 0% poverty. Those are the two extremes we saw in the data. Both are not suitable. So we plotted the different potential poverty cutoffs, and we proposed a cutoff of 30%. You're multidimensionally poor if you're deprived in the weighted indicators of more than 30%. There are two reasons for that. One, it amounts to more than one dimension. So we have 5 dimensions. One dimension weighs 20%. So you have to be deprived in more than just one dimension. Secondly, it is conceptual as well. Mauritius is an upper middle income country. The appropriate monetary poverty line is 8.3% according to the World Bank. In 2023, the poverty rate in monetary poverty in Mauritius was 11.3%. So we are orienting at that as well, because both monetary and non-monetary measures of poverty complement each other. They're not in competition, so to say. They complement each other to complete the picture. So this is the second step. Once we are making that decision of 30%, which will go through robustness analysis and other statistical tests, we're able to produce what we call the 3 headline figures that you will then see in the newspaper and elsewhere, which is the headcount ratio, number 1, H, the average intensity of poverty, A, and the MDI value. So what does that mean? If we apply the poverty cutoff of 1, we apply the poverty cutoff of 30%. The question is, what is the poverty rate in Mauritius, according to multidimensional poverty? In this case, it's 12.4%. It's close to the 11.3% in monetary poverty. 12.4%. The next question is, of course, you identify households that are poor. What we want to know is, how poor are they? What is the average intensity of that poverty? Is it 30%? Is it 35%? Is it 40%? The depth of poverty that Derek was talking about at the beginning. That's the average intensity of poverty among the poor. Mauritius, that's 35.7%. So those 12.4% are on average deprived from 35.7% of those indicators, which means they're relatively close to the poverty cutoff of 30%. So now, if you take both measures together, you get the MPI value, which for Mauritius is 0.044. It is a range from 0 to 1. Closer to 0, the better. So in this case, it is close to 0. So there are incentives to really close the gap for those that are poor. Another great advantage of the measure is foster method, which is the MPI measure. We can now look beyond the national level and we can start to disaggregate by islands, Mauritius, Maurice, by administrative level, and so forth. So if I can put your attention to the middle, on H. At the national level, we saw 12.4%. Now comparing Mauritius and Maurice, we see that Maurice with 34.6% is poorer, almost 3 times, than Mauritius with 11.6%. I think this is intuitive. I think no one in the room right now would say that doesn't make sense. No? We can talk about that.
So here you will see that the head count ratio for Mauritius is 11.6 and Rodriguez is higher, 5%. So if you compare it with our results on monitoring, you will see more or less the same trend. But always Rodriguez has a higher head count in terms of both monitoring and the report is published on the website.
Thank you, Shannon. That's exactly true. It is therefore not completely counterintuitive that we see this as well in the non-monetary measure. Now, what's interesting, however, is you put your attention to the average intensity A. Yeah? So, how poor are those who are poor in Mauritius? You see that in Mauritius, the average intensity is 35.3% compared to 38.8% in Mauritius. That means that those who are poor are in fact facing similar intensities, which is quite an interesting fact. If it were another big gap, that would be bad news as well for Maurice. Taking them both measures together, we see that Maurice at the MPI value has a higher MPI value than Mauritius, which I think seems to become quite sensitive. Another output that you will get in the reported statistics is what we call censoring of the non-poor. Jean-André said several times, and it's quite right. We have 15 indicators. Each one of us could be deprived in one. They could happen. You could be vulnerable to employment. You could lose your house. You could have a flood. Yeah? That doesn't mean you're poor, necessarily. We're saying you're poor when you have more than one, 30%. So what you will see here in the example, let's say with the vulnerable employment of 21.7%. If you're looking then at the red bar of 4.6%, it means only 4.6% of those that are poor are also deprived in vulnerable employment. So many of those in vulnerable employment are not necessarily what I mentioned before. This we call this the censoring. It gives you clear focus on the poor next to the poor population. And finally, one interesting contribution of the MPI is what we call the percentage contribution. What is driving the results? Why is Mauritius, why are the 12.4% in Mauritius poor? Is it because of employment? Is it because of health? Is it because of education? And so on and so forth. So what we have here, we can see that the 2 education indicators contribute each with roughly 25% to the MPI value, followed by suffering from disability, which is also quite high. It's not a clear roadmap of what to do, but it gives you an indication of where the problems are. And all of this will be then provided for, which we believe is also the great advantage of using the census for each lowest administrative unit. We can really dig deep into poverty in Mauritius at the lowest geographical level. So Jean-André will help.
Otherwise, you will. How do you pronounce Rodriguez? So you will agree with me, having a head count ratio of 12.4 may not be that high for police. So having this map, you can see the poverty head count. The darker the regions, the higher the level of poverty. So here you can use this map for policy. Just like Frank presented the contributions of the different dimensions, where you saw the education dimension as an area for intervention. So similarly, you can use same to address at community-based level. So here you can see the higher the headcount ratio, that it is 31%, 45%, the higher the headcount, the poorest region. And if we look at the map of Mauritius, you can see Le Monde, Cas-Noyade as the poorest regions, the highest headcount ratios. And then you can see the towns in Prime Media. So here you have the towns of Prime Mediums, Le Monde and Cas-Noyade here. And then you have some of the regions in the east, southeast, Wadis-Amouet. So some of the villages also have less headcount, but it is across the island. So this information. So now this is the reason why we're using. You remember I talked about the data set to be used. The data set as relevant for the MPI. Statistics Mauritius, we collect information at census. And then we have surveys. Okay? The census, everyone is here, is counted. You have the whole coverage. The sample, it is a sample. That is, we take a sample of the data from the 3,000 households. So using the census it is the only source data that you can disaggregate your information at disaggregated level, disaggregated geographical level. If you use a survey data, you won't be able to disaggregate your results. You will only have a result at national or let's say at by island level. You won't be able to disaggregate by geographical level. So this is the benefits of using census data. Census data you can disaggregate by regional level as well as population group.
Thank you so much. Exactly. Another thing we can actually use then those three different maps. We have age, headcount ratio, average intensities, and MPI. Now, Mauritius, we see that the same region are in red that were at the average intensities that were at the headcount ratio. So it's the same, it's an overlap, so to say. We see this with the MPI. Now, if we're going to we see that the poorest area is Marisha. Yeah, it was almost 40%. What's here interesting, it is not the intensity of poverty in that area is not the highest in Marisha. It's actually in Port Maturi. Okay. But eventually we see at the MPI level, it will be again Marisha. But you see hopefully the benefits here. So of really digging in, it's not a black box. Not a black box, it's quite transparent what's going on. You can really see what is driving the results and how the results differ, which I think is really important for policy. So to wrap up, some interesting observations we have seen so far. We see obviously the census data, we are quite confident in our disaggregations by household level, for example. We see that female-headed households are clearly poorer. Again, I believe this is not counterintuitive. We also see that households with more children tend to be poorer. Those who have 3 or more children, which we also see in many other contexts. So again, non-counterintuitive, I believe. We see that couples with unmarried children tend to be the least poor. I mean, we're looking at different household types. There are many different forms of households, how they live together. So we see that at least those are the least poor in that sense. And finally, we see that children, those below 60 years of age and those beyond 60 years of age, and elderly, are the poorest, which demonstrates again a little bit what is feasible with the MPI. Eventually, we're open for discussions. Clearly, we still have a consultation. We wrap up now. There were clear feedback we received to include as well an assets indicator to capture wealth. We're working on that and moving into obviously further discussions. Thank you so much.
Thank you.